The Nexus Prime Academy had always prided itself on being the galaxy's most prestigious military training facility, where the finest specimens from 100 different species learned the art of warfare alongside beings who could theoretically eat them for breakfast. It was, according to the recruitment brochures, a shining example of interspecies cooperation. What those brochures failed to mention was that most days resembled a barely controlled zoo where the inmates had access to plasma rifles. On this particular morning, the Academy's carefully maintained facade of competence was about to receive a rather spectacular kick in its collective posterior, courtesy of 3 juvenile specimens who had apparently missed the memo about proper educational decorum. Cadet Ezra Hawthorne stood at exactly 5 feet 9 inches of what his instructors generously called human average, which in a facility populated by 8-foot Draknari warriors and crystalline Vorthak giants made him roughly equivalent to a particularly ambitious house plant. His presence at Nexus Prime was something of an ongoing joke among the student body, though nobody could quite figure out whether the punchline was his species' laughable physical capabilities or the Academy's apparent descent into charitable admissions policies. The morning had started promisingly enough, with Ezra successfully navigating the cafeteria without being accidentally stepped on by a Goliathan exchange student, which honestly counted as a personal victory these days. He'd even managed to finish his reconstituted protein paste without anyone making jokes about human digestive limitations, though the day was still young, and hope was a dangerous thing at Nexus Prime. The first sign of impending disaster came in the form of Instructor Nora's voice crackling through the Academy's communication system, carrying that particular tone of barely restrained panic that experienced educators developed after years of dealing with beings capable of casual property destruction. "Attention, all personnel," came the announcement, each word carefully measured in that way that suggested the speaker was simultaneously trying to maintain authority while secretly questioning their life choices. "We are experiencing a minor containment situation in Laboratory Complex 7. All students are advised to remain in their current locations while security handles the matter." Ezra paused mid-chew, his human survival instincts immediately translating minor containment situation into "something has gone horribly wrong, and we're all probably doomed." Years of attending an academy where routine training exercises occasionally resulted in small-scale evacuations had taught him that administrative euphemisms were inversely proportional to actual safety levels. The second announcement came approximately 47 seconds later, which in crisis management terms was roughly equivalent to watching someone fall off a cliff in slow motion. All personnel are now advised to avoid Laboratory Complex 7 and the surrounding corridors. Security teams are responding to what appears to be a more significant containment breach. Please remain calm and follow standard emergency protocols. Through the cafeteria's reinforced transparasteel windows, Ezra could see security personnel running across the courtyard with the sort of purposeful urgency that suggested their standard emergency protocols were being thoroughly tested. Several were carrying what appeared to be neural suppressors, which meant whatever had escaped was both alive and thoroughly uninterested in voluntary cooperation. The third announcement arrived with mathematical precision, exactly 93 seconds after the second, and featured the unmistakable sound of someone shouting in the background. "Attention, all personnel. We are now implementing full emergency lockdown procedures. 3 juvenile apex specimens have breached containment and are currently mobile. All non-essential personnel are ordered to remain in secure locations until further notice. Security Chief Ash has authorized the use of Level 3 containment protocols." Ezra felt his eyebrows perform that peculiarly human gesture of ascending toward his hairline, an expression that would have been utterly meaningless to 90% of his classmates, but conveyed volumes to the few humans scattered throughout the facility. Level 3 protocols meant the escaped specimens were considered actively dangerous, not just inconveniently mobile. The cafeteria around him had descended into that peculiar mixture of excitement and concern that characterized most academy emergencies. The Draknari students were displaying various degrees of aggressive interest, their scaled features brightening with the prospect of actual combat. The Vorthak contingent had begun that low harmonic humming that indicated either deep thought or preparation for violence, and frankly, the distinction had never been entirely clear. The few other humans present were doing what humans did best in crisis situations, looking worried while trying to appear useful. Outside, the situation was rapidly evolving from containment breach to absolute pandemonium with the sort of efficiency that suggested years of practice. Security personnel were now carrying progressively larger weapons, and someone had apparently decided that the Academy's emergency klaxons needed to be tested at maximum volume because the entire facility was now vibrating with the sort of rhythmic wailing that made concentration impossible and headaches inevitable. Ezra watched through the windows as Security Chief Ash himself appeared in the courtyard, his imposing Goliathan frame moving with a sort of determined stride that indicated personal involvement in crisis management. Behind him trailed a collection of security personnel who seemed to be carrying every piece of non-lethal containment equipment the Academy possessed, which suggested either thorough preparation or mounting desperation. The fourth announcement came with a new voice, deeper and carrying the unmistakable authority of senior leadership. "This is Commander Vex speaking. All students and non-essential personnel are to remain in lockdown until further notice. The escaped specimens are 3 juvenile apex predators, approximately 6 months old, and are to be considered extremely dangerous despite their age. Do not attempt to approach or contain these specimens. Repeat, do not engage." Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach because juvenile apex predators were the sort of creatures that made grown Draknari warriors reconsider their career choices. Standing roughly 4 feet at the shoulder, even as cubs, they possessed all the natural weaponry of their adult counterparts, compressed into packages of boundless energy and absolutely no impulse control. They were, essentially, living weapons that hadn't yet learned proper target discrimination. The fact that there were 3 of them loose in an educational facility filled with potential prey species was the sort of scenario that emergency planners wrote worst-case studies about, usually while consuming large quantities of recreational pharmaceuticals to cope with the implications. Through the transparastile, Ezra could see the search teams spreading out across the courtyard in what appeared to be a coordinated sweep pattern. Their movements were professional and purposeful, suggesting years of training and preparation for exactly this sort of situation, which made it all the more concerning when the first scream echoed across the academy grounds approximately 30 seconds later. The scream was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large and metallic being enthusiastically destroyed, which suggested that the security teams had located at least one of their targets. Unfortunately, based on the subsequent sounds of running feet and creative profanity in several languages, the encounter had not gone according to their carefully planned containment procedures. Ezra pressed his face against the window, human curiosity overriding the more sensible instinct to find the deepest, most secure hiding place available. In the distance, he could see figures running across the academy grounds with the sort of panicked urgency that indicated their training had not adequately prepared them for the current situation. A 5th announcement crackled through the communication system, this time featuring Commander Vex's voice with significantly less composure than before. Security teams Alpha and Beta are to converge on Sector 12 immediately. The specimens have demonstrated unexpected mobility and are heading toward the residential quarters. All students in dormitories 7 through 15 are to implement immediate barricade protocols. The cafeteria around Ezra had fallen into an unusual silence as several hundred young predators from across the galaxy processed the implications of 3 apex cubs treating the Academy's security forces as an amusing diversion. Even the Draknari had stopped their aggressive posturing, which suggested they understood exactly what sort of creatures were currently treating Nexus Prime as their personal playground. Outside, the sounds of pursuit and destruction were growing closer, accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like juvenile roars of delight. The cubs, it appeared, were having the time of their lives. Commander Vex Ironspike had spent the better part of 3 decades perfecting the art of military competence, climbing through the ranks of the Draknari Defense Corps with a sort of methodical determination that had made his species the galaxy's premier shock troops. His record was immaculate, his tactical assessments legendary, and his ability to maintain order under pressure had become something of an academy talking point. All of which made the current situation particularly galling, because 3 creatures roughly the size of oversized house pets were systematically dismantling his carefully constructed reputation. The first wave of security personnel had returned from their encounter with what Medical Officer Bex diplomatically termed multiple contusions and a severe crisis of confidence. Their neural suppressors had proven spectacularly ineffective, primarily because the cubs moved with a sort of joyful unpredictability that made target acquisition roughly equivalent to trying to catch lightning while blindfolded. "Sir," reported Security Chief Ash, his massive Goliathan frame somehow managing to look diminished despite standing nearly 9 feet tall. "The specimens appear to be treating our containment efforts as some form of recreational activity." Vex felt his scaled features twitch in what another species might have mistaken for amusement, but was actually the Draknari equivalent of a migraine developing in real time. Through the command center's monitoring screens, he could watch the cubs bounding through the Academy's corridors with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for natural disasters or particularly energetic explosions. The largest of the 3, which Communications Officer Psi had helpfully designated as Claw, based on the distinctive gouges it left in bulkheads, had discovered the Academy's gravity adjustment system and was currently entertaining itself by leaping between floors with a sort of physics-defying grace that made seasoned warriors question their understanding of basic locomotion. Each landing was accompanied by a sound like a small meteorite impact, followed by what could only be described as delighted purring. "Deployment of sonic barriers has proven ineffective," continued Ash, consulting a data pad that appeared to have been recently mauled. "The specimens appear to find the frequency range amusing rather than deterrent." On the screens, the second cub, designated Fang for reasons that became apparent when she smiled, was demonstrating her species' natural problem-solving abilities by systematically dismantling every security measure the Academy possessed. Her approach to locked doors involved the sort of direct methodology that bypass codes were never intended to address, and her technique with energy barriers suggested a profound disrespect for basic physics. Vex activated the Academy-wide communication system, his voice carrying the sort of controlled authority that had once made entire battle fleets fall into formation. "All security teams, implement Protocol 7. Full containment nets, coordinated from multiple vectors." The response came back with mathematical precision. Approximately 4 minutes of confident tactical chatter, followed by the unmistakable sounds of expensive equipment being enthusiastically redistributed across several corridors. The cubs, it appeared, had strong opinions about nets, and those opinions involved creative applications of their natural weaponry. Technical specialist Hex approached the command station with the sort of careful movements that suggested recent traumatic experiences with technology failures. "Sir, our tracking systems indicate the specimens are moving in what appears to be a coordinated pattern. They're not just randomly exploring, they're herding our security teams." Vex paused in the middle of reviewing tactical deployments because the implications of that statement were the sort that made experienced commanders reconsider their career choices. If the cubs were demonstrating pack-hunting behaviors, then the situation had evolved from containment breach to "we are being systematically outmaneuvered by toddlers." On the primary screen, the third cub, Bolt, named for his apparent ability to violate several fundamental laws of physics simultaneously, was demonstrating why conventional pursuit tactics were insufficient for apex predators. His movement through the Academy's corridors resembled nothing so much as controlled lightning, appearing in one location just long enough to thoroughly confuse pursuing security personnel before materializing somewhere entirely different. "Sir," called Equipment Manager Wade from his monitoring station, his voice carrying that particular tone of professional despair that technical personnel developed when their equipment proved inadequate to current circumstances. "The Cubs have just discovered the recreational facilities." Vex felt his tactical assessment of the situation undergo rapid and unwelcome revision, because the Academy's recreational facilities contained approximately 17 different types of exercise equipment, most of which could be repurposed as improvised weapons by creatures with sufficient imagination and natural armament. The sounds echoing through the communication system suggested the Cubs possessed both qualities in abundance. "Deploy the riot suppression systems," ordered Vex, activating protocols that hadn't been used since the infamous Vorthek cultural exchange incident 3 years prior. Full atmospheric saturation with neural dampening agents. The results were immediate and thoroughly disappointing. Instead of the expected pacification effects, the Cubs appeared to find the altered atmosphere invigorating, their energy levels increasing to what Academy Administrator Pax later described as physically impossible but empirically observable. Behavioral specialist Uma consulted her portable analysis unit with the sort of frantic determination that suggested her academic credentials were being personally challenged by 3 juvenile delinquents. "Commander, the specimens are exhibiting play behavior patterns. They're not attempting escape. They're enjoying the interaction." Which meant, Vex realized with growing horror, that his security forces were not pursuing dangerous escapees, but rather participating in an elaborate game of tag with creatures who possessed every possible advantage except impulse control. The Cubs were having fun, and every escalation in containment efforts was simply making their recreational experience more engaging. "Sir, xenobiology." Expert Yara's voice carried across the command center with the sort of urgency that accompanied major revelations or impending catastrophes. "The Cubs are approaching the civilian residential sector if they enter the family quarters." She didn't need to finish the sentence because everyone present understood the implications. The Academy's civilian population included dependents from dozens of species, most of whom possessed exactly 0 natural defenses against apex predators in recreational moods. The Cubs weren't malicious, but their idea of playful interaction could easily prove fatal to beings who hadn't evolved with retractable claws and reinforced skeletal structures. Vex activated every security protocol the Academy possessed, calling in additional personnel from 3 neighboring sectors and authorizing the use of equipment typically reserved for actual combat situations. The response was immediate, professional, and thoroughly inadequate, as 47 highly trained security specialists discovered that their combined expertise meant approximately nothing to 3 Cubs who had apparently attended the Academy of Chaos and Selective Physics Violation. The situation reached its crescendo when Senior Cadet Orion, a promising young Draknari whose tactical scores suggested future command potential, volunteered to lead a specialized containment team armed with the Academy's most advanced restraint systems. His confidence was admirable, his preparation thorough, and his subsequent retreat through the cafeteria windows was visible to approximately half the student body. "Commander," announced student observer Mika from her monitoring station, her voice carrying the sort of fascinated horror that accompanied truly spectacular failures. "The Cubs have just discovered they can use the ventilation system as a transportation network," which meant Vex understood with crystalline clarity that 3 apex predators now had unrestricted access to every section of the Academy simultaneously, while his security forces remained limited to conventional corridors and the occasional undignified sprint across open courtyards. The communications system crackled with reports from across the facility. Cubs appearing in unexpected locations, security teams arriving to find empty corridors and artistic claw marks, and the growing realization that traditional military tactics were fundamentally inadequate for opponents who treated physics as a polite suggestion rather than an absolute law. "Sir," called Ash, his professional composure finally beginning to show stress fractures. "We have a new development. There's a human cadet requesting permission to approach the situation." Vex looked up from his tactical displays with the sort of expression that suggested sanity was becoming an increasingly negotiable concept. "A human? Cadet Ezra, sir. He's volunteering to help with containment." The command center fell into one of those profound silences that accompanies moments when the universe reveals its fundamental sense of humor. Here they were, with the galaxy's finest security personnel, proving utterly inadequate against 3 playful cubs, and their potential salvation was arriving in the form of a species whose primary evolutionary advantage was the ability to sweat efficiently. Vex stared at the security feeds, watching his carefully trained teams continue their elaborate game of 3-dimensional tag with opponents who appeared to be keeping score. The Cubs were winning. "Send him in," Vex said finally, his voice carrying the sort of resignation that came with accepting that conventional wisdom had just filed for bankruptcy. "At this point, what's the worst that could happen?" Ezra approached the chaos zone with the sort of unhurried pace that made seasoned warriors question whether humans possessed the same basic survival instincts as other sentient species. While 47 security specialists maintained strategic positions behind reinforced barriers, weapons trained on empty corridors where the Cubs had last been sighted, the lone human strolled into the epicenter of destruction, carrying nothing more threatening than a small food container and what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Cadet?" Commander Vex's voice crackled through his communication device, carrying the sort of barely controlled tension that accompanied watching someone walk into a minefield while humming cheerfully. "The specimens are considered extremely dangerous. Maintain safe distance and await backup." Ezra paused to examine a section of wall where Claw had apparently decided to test the structural integrity of Academy architecture through direct application of natural weaponry. The gouges were impressive, running nearly 3 feet deep into reinforced composite materials that were theoretically capable of withstanding direct plasma fire. The Cubs weren't just playing, they were unconsciously demonstrating why their species had evolved at the apex of every food chain they encountered. "Understood, Commander," Ezra replied, his voice carrying that peculiar human quality of sounding completely relaxed in situations where relaxation suggested either supreme confidence or complete detachment from reality. "I'll be careful." The first cub appeared exactly 37 seconds later, materializing from a ventilation grate with the sort of fluid grace that made physics professors reconsider their understanding of momentum conservation. Bolt landed in the corridor approximately 15 feet from Ezra, 4 feet of concentrated predatory perfection whose amber eyes immediately focused on this new and interesting development. Security personnel throughout the sector held their collective breath, neural suppressors charged and ready, waiting for the inevitable moment when the human would realize exactly how far out of his depth he had wandered. Bolt crouched low, muscles tensing with the sort of coiled energy that preceded either playful pouncing or serious violence, and frankly, the distinction wasn't always clear until after the fact. Ezra looked at the cub for approximately 3 seconds, tilted his head slightly in what behavioral specialists would later identify as a classic human expression of friendly interest, and smiled. Not the sort of aggressive smile that most species use to display weaponry or establish dominance, but the genuine human expression of uncomplicated pleasure that had somehow evolved to indicate everything from greeting friends to appreciating particularly appealing food. It was, by any reasonable military standard, completely inappropriate for the current tactical situation. Bolt's predatory crouch faltered, amber eyes widening with what could only be described as confusion. The cub had spent the last several hours encountering beings who radiated fear, aggression, or professional determination, emotional states that triggered every instinct his species had developed for identifying either threats or prey. But this human was broadcasting something entirely different, authentic enjoyment of the moment, without any underlying agenda or concealed hostility. The second cub arrived through a different ventilation grate, Fang dropping into the corridor with a sort of controlled impact that suggested she had been tracking the encounter through the Academy's sensor network. Her appearance created a tactical nightmare scenario. Two apex predators positioned to attack from multiple vectors, while their target remained completely exposed. Ezra turned to acknowledge the new arrival, his smile broadening with what appeared to be genuine delight. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice carrying the sort of warmth that humans typically reserved for encountering something unexpectedly wonderful. Fang froze. Mid-prowl, her natural hunting sequence interrupted by an emotional response she had no evolutionary framework to process. The human wasn't exhibiting any of the behaviors that triggered predatory reactions. No fear scent, no aggressive posturing, no attempt at dominance or submission. Instead, he was radiating the sort of uncomplicated happiness that young creatures of most species associated with positive pack interactions. The third cub arrived with characteristic unpredictability, Claw simply appearing in the corridor as though he had been there all along, and everyone else had somehow failed to notice. His presence completed the tactical encirclement that should have represented game over for any creature without significant combat capabilities. Instead, Ezra's smile somehow managed to become even more genuine, his posture shifting into what ethologists would recognize as the universal mammalian expression of non-threatening pleasure. He opened his food container, revealing what appeared to be some form of processed nutrition bar, and took a small bite while maintaining eye contact with all three cubs. The predators exchanged glances, their pack communication systems processing this unprecedented situation through rapid micro-expressions and subtle body language. Their human target was displaying behaviors that triggered protective rather than predatory instincts, emotional states they associated with pack members rather than potential threats or prey. Slowly, carefully, Ezra extended his hand toward Bolt, palm open and containing a small piece of his nutrition bar. His movement was deliberate and unthreatening, the sort of gesture that transcended species boundaries to communicate peaceful intent. Bolt approached with the sort of cautious curiosity that characterized intelligent predators encountering something outside their normal experience parameters. The cub's amber eyes remained fixed on Ezra's face, reading emotional cues with the sort of precision that had kept his species alive for millions of years of evolution. When Bolt gently accepted the offered food, his rough tongue briefly touching Ezra's palm in acknowledgement, the human's smile somehow managed to become even more radiant. Throughout the Academy's monitoring systems, security personnel watched in stunned silence as three apex predators settled into relaxed positions around a single human who had apparently convinced them that he represented safety rather than entertainment. The procession that made its way back to Laboratory Complex 7 resembled nothing so much as a casual nature walk, if nature walks typically involved three apex predators following a human cadet with the sort of devoted attention usually reserved for beloved pack leaders. Ezra strolled through corridors that had recently been combat zones, sharing pieces of his nutrition bar and engaging in what appeared to be meaningful conversation with creatures whose vocal cords produced sounds that could, theoretically, shatter reinforced transparent steel. Security personnel lined the route like honor guards at a particularly surreal military parade, their expensive containment equipment rendered utterly obsolete by the simple expedient of treating the cubs like the intelligent young beings they actually were. Commander Vex followed at what he deemed a tactically appropriate distance, his scaled features displaying the sort of expression that suggested his entire understanding of tactical doctrine was undergoing rapid and involuntary revision. The fascinating aspect, observed behavioral specialist Uma, consulting her analytical equipment with the sort of academic enthusiasm that accompanied paradigm-shifting discoveries, is that the human identified the cub's actual motivation within moments of encounter. They weren't exhibiting aggressive or escape behaviors. They were displaying classic pack-bonding exploration patterns. Ezra paused at the laboratory entrance, crouching down to meet Bolt at eye level, while Fang and Claw flanked him in protective positions. His conversation with the cubs involved a mixture of human vocalizations and what appeared to be intuitive mimicry of their own communication patterns, creating a linguistic bridge that formal xenobiology had declared theoretically impossible. "Come on, then," Ezra said, his voice carrying the sort of gentle authority that parents across 100 species recognized instinctively. "Time to go home." The cubs exchanged glances, their pack communication systems processing this instruction through the lens of their newly established social hierarchy. Ezra had proven himself worthy of leadership through the simple expedient of treating them as individuals rather than problems to be solved, and their response demonstrated the sort of willing cooperation that no amount of technological coercion could have achieved. They followed him into the containment facility with the sort of voluntary compliance that made the last 4 hours of military-grade chaos seem like an elaborate practical joke perpetrated by the universe itself. Medical Officer Bex conducted the mandatory post-incident health assessments, while the cubs submitted to examination with remarkable patience, apparently viewing the procedures as an extension of their positive interaction with their human friend. Her report would later note that the subjects showed no signs of stress or agitation, unlike the security personnel who had spent the afternoon discovering new limitations of conventional tactics. Cadet Hawthorne, Commander Vex approached with the sort of measured pace that suggested he was still processing the implications of what he had witnessed. "Your unconventional methods appear to have resolved a situation that our standard protocols could not address." Ezra straightened from where he had been saying goodbye to Claw, his expression carrying that peculiar human mixture of modesty and quiet satisfaction. "They're just kids, sir. Scared kids in a new environment, looking for someone who understood that they needed reassurance rather than restraint." The simplicity of that observation hung in the air like a revelation, because it highlighted exactly how thoroughly the Academy's sophisticated response systems had missed the fundamental nature of the problem. 47 trained security specialists had approached the situation as a tactical challenge requiring technological solutions, while one human cadet had recognized it as an emotional situation requiring nothing more complicated than genuine kindness. Student Observer Micah's incident report would eventually become required reading at military academies across 17 sectors, not for its tactical insights, but for its documentation of what happened when someone approached apex predators with empathy rather than fear. The report's conclusion noted that the human species' evolutionary development of advanced social cognition had produced capabilities that conventional military doctrine had never adequately considered. Academy Administrator Pax's official statement emphasized the successful resolution of the containment breach while carefully avoiding any mention of how spectacularly their standard procedures had failed. His private notes, however, contained several pointed observations about the necessity of incorporating human psychological insights into xenobiological protocols. As Nexus Prime Academy settled back into its routine of barely controlled educational chaos, the story of the human cadet who smiled at apex predators spread through the facility with the sort of velocity that accompanied truly memorable lessons. The cubs had taught everyone present something fundamental about the difference between controlling others and earning their trust, though they had required a human to translate that lesson into terms the galaxy's finest military minds could understand. The final irony, noted by several observers, was that the species everyone considered weakest had demonstrated a strength that all their advanced technology and tactical training had failed to match. The simple power of treating others with genuine respect and kindness. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution was just being decent to each other.